Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome back to our study, our women's study circle, which is our Wednesday daytime study circle that we have, that myself and Ustada Fatima Lette, that we share in our studying of the Hadith of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We are covering the Arba'in, the collection of 40 hadith by Imam al-Nawawi, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of pause here. So inshallah, today we're covering hadith number 5. We're covering hadith number 5. Just excuse me for a second while I try to get it loaded up. I'm going to try to load it up on Instagram, inshallah, as well. Let me see if I can do that. So I have it here on Facebook. And I'm going to see if I can get it loaded up on Instagram really quick, inshallah. All right, cool. Alhamdulillah. Alrighty. So today's hadith is hadith number 5. Hadith number 5 in the Arba'in of Imam Nawawi is on the authority of Aisha radiallahu anha, that she narrates that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fa huwa rad. So the hadith is pretty short, but it's man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fa huwa raddun. There's another narration that's similar, but it's slightly different, which is man amila amalan laysa alayhi amruna fahuwa raddun, which shares a similar meaning. We'll talk about the differences, inshallah. So what is the translation of this hadith, and what are the implications of this hadith for us, in our time? So the Prophet ﷺ, the translation is that whoever innovates something, right? Ahdatha means to bring something new. So whoever brings something new, fi amrina hadha. What's amrina hadha? In our religion, in this religion, the Prophet ﷺ is talking about in our matter, in our affair, right? Ma laysa minhu. That is not something that is from it. That is not something that is of it. That is from it. Then he said, alayhi salam, fahuwa rad. That thing will be rejected, right? That thing is going to be rejected. So how does this hadith teach us about what is allowed in Islam and what is allowed for us to do? And this is actually a really interesting question, because a lot of people have the question about what is allowable in Islam. How do we know whether or not something is permissible in Islam or not? Do we just say that, well, unless it's mentioned explicitly in the Quran, unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it himself, then it's absolutely, that's it. That's the only thing that's allowed. How about, what if the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in the hadith, what if it's not mentioned either way? So the question that a lot of people have is like, well, how do we know whether or not something is allowed in the religion? How do we know, is it okay for us to drive cars? Is it okay for us to watch television? Is it okay for us to do these things? What is the Prophet ﷺ talking about? And many of us may have heard of the word bid'ah. Bid'ah means an innovation, a religious innovation. Many of us may have heard that word being used about certain things. Sorry, let me just put my stuff on mute. Okay. Many of us may have heard that word being used about certain things. So how do we understand that word in its context? Generally, the understanding of innovation of a bid'ah is something that is done, an action that is done that is thought to have religious significance, an action that is thought to have religious significance that is not from the religion. So if somebody tries to innovate or invent something new that they believe has inherent religious significance that is not from the religion, there's no evidence that supports that claim whatsoever. But things like driving a car, things like going to school, things like wearing, shirt and pants, as long as it's covering a person's aura, these things are not considered innovations, okay? These things are not considered innovations. So what is the lesson that we learn from this hadith here that you see on the screen? That whoever innovates something in this matter, right? Fi amrina hadha, that this, in this religion, that is not from it, then it is rejected. Number one is that a person's intention is not enough in the actions that they are doing. Okay, a person's intention is not enough. Now, we know that intention is necessary for an action to be accepted. The Prophet ﷺ said, and it was the hadith that we covered earlier, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that actions are only by their intentions. So we know that intentions are necessary. I can't just stand up and bow and prostrate and stand and bow and prostrate and stand without having the intention in my chest that this is for prayer. Okay, if I go and I do all the motions of prayer, but it's not in my chest, it's not in my heart that this is what I'm doing, I'm praying to Allah, then that prayer is not accepted because the intention's absent. So we know that intention is necessary. However, on the other end, we also know that the intention has to be accompanied by an action that is done in accordance with the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the scholars say that in order for an act of worship to be accepted, scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, scholars like Ash-Shafi'i, scholars like Imam al-Ghazali, and others, great usuli minds, people who came up with Islamic legal theory, or they codified it, didn't come up with it, they codified it. They said that the intention of an action needs to be something that is done with sincerity. So the intention has to be sincere, but the action also should be done, right, for the sake of Allah and following the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So good intentions are not enough. That's lesson number one. That if a person has a good intention, that's good, but it's not enough. A person can't say, well, I want to pray 4 rak'ats for Fajr. I want to pray 4 rak'ats for Fajr. And you ask that person, you say, why? And they say, well, because I love praying and Fajr 2 rak'ats is just not enough for me. I want to get more out of it. Right? And you tell the person, look, your niyyah is good. Your intention is good. You want to do more prayer, but you're skipping on the following of the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the methodology has to be from the methodology of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If a person wants their action to be accepted, then their intention has to be good, but they also have to make sure that I'm not doing it in a way that's going against what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us. Okay? So we believe that the Prophet ﷺ, that his job was not simply just to deliver the Quran to us. We believe that it wasn't just to deliver the book, but it was also to model the Quran to us, to show us how to live it. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ati'u Allah wa Rasul," that obey Allah and his messenger. Because Allah in the Quran is teaching us what? That the messenger of God also has the role of a teacher and a modeler and somebody that can show you how this religion is meant to be practiced. His job was not simply the job of like a mailman, right? Or a delivery person that he's coming with this book and dropping it off and saying, okay. No, the job of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was to also exemplify the parameters with which we practice the religion. How do we practice religion, right? Allah Ta'ala says, he calls the Prophet ﷺ something beautiful in the Quran. He calls him uswatun hasana, that he is a beautiful example for those people who yearn for Allah, who yearn for the afterlife, and who remember Allah greatly, that the Prophet ﷺ is their example. So number one is that we have to understand in any action that we're doing, that we are hoping for a reward from Allah. Okay, in any action that is an act of worship from Allah, that it is something, it will benefit us if we ask ourselves and do a little bit of research, either by asking a scholar or either by asking, researching it, from some books that we own or things like that, right? Going to some reliable research. How did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ do this? Okay, so, I want to start a community. I want to start doing, I want to start offering this community program. How did the Prophet ﷺ structure his community, right? What are the parameters? What did he allow? He may have done it in a certain way, but he also may have allowed it in a certain way here. So I need to know from a perspective of Islamic law, like what did the Prophet ﷺ say about this? And most things, there's a general clear guidance on permissibility. Within other issues, there might be some what we call difference of opinion, some ikhtilaf. But that's what the scholars who train for years and years and years, people like my teacher, Sheikh Abdel Nasser, people like my colleagues, Mufti Kamani and Sheikh Mikhail and Mufti Muntasir, and Ustada Atifa and Fatima, this is why they read and they train for years and years Just like we expect lawyers to be versed in constitutional law and understand federal and state law, we also expect Islamic scholars to understand Islamic law, which is its own corpus of literature and text. Okay, so that's number one. Good intentions are not enough. Number two, it's also important for us to understand that innovations here that the Prophet ﷺ are talking about is not your iPhone. It's not this. Innovation is something that is like celebrated in technology, right? But the word innovation from an Islamic perspective is something that is considered bad, right? We don't want to innovate in the religion, but we want to innovate in technology. We want to innovate in medicine, right? Coronavirus, vaccine development is innovation. They're trying to innovate to figure something out, but we don't want to innovate in Salat al-Dhuhr. Like, that's not what we want to innovate. So what's the difference between those two actions, between phones and between prayer? What's the difference, guys? You tell me, inshallah, in the comments. What are the differences between our computers and our salah? What's the difference between our iPhones and our, fasting, or, our I don't know, our homes and our zakat? The difference is one of them is something that is mundane in its nature. It's mundane. It's considered, daily, mundane, ordinary life. Okay, and the fiqh term that is used is mu'amalat. The actions that are just sort of mundane. There's no specific ritualistic reward that's assigned to them, right? Owning a phone does not give you hasanat. Owning a phone does not give you good deeds. It's just an action that's permissible. But now there's a realm of worship. There's a realm of deeds from the realm of ibadat. So there's actions, and then there's actions of worship. There's ordinary actions, and then there's actions of worship. Innovation in ordinary actions is fine. Innovations in ordinary actions is fine. But innovation in religious actions, that's what the Prophet ﷺ is talking about here. So whenever we think about the practice of a religious action, of ibadat, we have to think about what boundaries and parameters Islam has for us in that matter. Okay? So this is the example of what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was saying. Now, there are in some capacities, right? And this is why, Islamic law is something that is very important to study. There are in some capacities some things that will not have existed during the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that will, right, be done within the realm of religious practice that will not have existed during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. What's an example of that? Using a microphone for prayer. Using a microphone for prayer is an example of something that did not exist during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, but we use it today because we have, for example, in our large masajid, we have a need for it to amplify the voice of the imam so that people can follow in prayer without difficulty. Okay? So this is a big question now. Is this considered a religious innovation? Can you change the performance of prayer by including something like a microphone, right? Or including something, like a television, for example, like maybe people have in separate rooms, there's a TV that broadcasts the prayer. Can we, in the masjid, how do we know whether or not this stuff is okay or not? How do we figure this out? Well, in Islamic law, there's four bodies of evidence, four primary bodies of evidence that are used to discuss whether or not something is found to be permissible or impermissible. The first is the Quran. The second is the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The third is what's called consensus. Okay. The third is called consensus, and the fourth is called qiyas, qiyas is what we're going to talk about now here, which is called analogy, analogical reasoning. Analogical reasoning is such. How do we know that it's okay for us to drive cars? How do we know that using cars to go to the masjid is okay? Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would ride an animal to the masjid. And the qiyas between using a vehicle, the Prophet ﷺ used an animal, and we are using an automobile. That precedent, that analogy, that analogical reasoning is sound. And so we take from the Prophet ﷺ's example precedence from this. He actually trained his companions to use precedents. He trained his companions to use precedents. He one time was sending one of his companions, Mu'adh bin Jabal, to Yemen. And he asked Mu'adh bin Jabal, he said, Kayfa taqdi ya Mu'adh? How are you going to judge between people? And Mu'adh, radiallahu anh, he said, I'm going to use the book of Allah, bi kitabillah, the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ said, okay, what if you don't find what you're looking for in the book of Allah? What if you don't find what you're looking for in the book of Allah? And that statement alone is something that would like shock most people. If we heard that, we're like, what do you mean? Can't find it in the book of Allah. But the Prophet ﷺ is speaking about what? A specific instance. The Quran does not address every specific instance. It gives us universal principles. So then Mu'adh said, then I will look in the sunnah of God's messenger. Then I will look in the example of God's messenger, what I know to be the example of God's messenger. The Prophet ﷺ said, okay, وَإِن لَمْ تَجِدْ, and what if you don't find it there? So now we're like, oh, did he just say that there's going to be something that's going to have to be ruled upon in a matter of either religion or mundane life that we won't be able to find explicit here is the key word, descript, specific, explicit guidance from the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And Mu'adh said, well, then what I'll do is I will use my intellect, I will use my ra'i, I will use my intellect, and I will take the Quran and the Sunnah, and I will try to provide a ruling based on these two things. What Mu'adh is describing here is qiyas, is analogical reasoning. So whenever scholars are asked a question, can I do this? Can I do that? Is it halal for me to do this? Is it haram for me to do that? And we don't have, scholars, they don't have an exact verse or a narration that tells us like this is halal or this is haram. Like, can I eat pork? Easy, right? Easy. It's answered in the Quran. Okay. Can I eat this? Easy, right? It's answered here. Can I do that? Easy. It's all these things are easy. But can I pray with a microphone? Can I pray with a microphone? It's like, oh man, well that's not answered in the Quran. Okay. The Sunnah, what can we, it's not specifically mentioned in the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ, they didn't have technology like that back then. So how do we navigate the situation, right? So then the scholars, what they'll do is they'll look at all of the evidences that they have, and they'll say, okay, what's called the illah? What's like the operative thing here that's being asked? Is it okay to amplify somebody's voice while they're leading the prayer? The amplification of the imam, their voice, so that the people behind them who are far away can hear them. Do we have any example of how this happens in the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? And there are examples. There are examples that there are people that were assigned to repeat after the milestone pronouncements of the imam, the takbir, right? That's why when you go to Masjid Haram in Mecca or Masjid Nabawi or some other masajid that you'll hear, Allahu Akbar, and you'll hear the mu'adhin, Allahu Akbar, like they'll say after them. Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana wa lakal hamd, like you'll hear the mu'adhin that will repeat after them, right? So this example was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why these masajid, that's why they'll keep it, to keep that sunnah, to honor that sunnah. But this evidence is one of the evidences that is used to legitimize that in a facility, technology like a microphone can be used to amplify the voice of the imam during prayer, right? So the reason I'm giving you that whole and that discussion, by the way, I very, very much made it very simple for the sake of using an example to illustrate this hadith, which is that this is not considered an innovation in the reference of what the Prophet ﷺ is considering it. Imam al-Shafi'i, he discussed a category of innovations, a category of religious practice, which is termed as what he called a good or a constructive innovation, bid'ah hasana, right? The one that the Prophet ﷺ is contextually speaking about here are any innovations that have no precedence, they have no foundation, they have no anchoring in the religion. They are just innovations that have been come up with from a person's own desire or a person's own intellect or some sort of prevailing ideology that exists around the the world. So the lesson that we take from this hadith is very important, which is whenever you're practicing something in the religion, it is a really, really beautiful and important practice to make sure that you understand where that practice comes from. It's very, very important for you. Number one is that it will add meaning to the action itself. It will add meaning. So to go and to ask a scholar and to say, we grew up praying in this way, or we grew up doing this when somebody passed away, we did this. When somebody got married, we did this. When somebody bought a house, we did this. And to ask that scholar to say, like, is there any, what's the basis for this? Like, is there any religious basis for this? Or is this cultural practice and this and this? So then you'll be able to learn and understand like why it is you're doing certain things, right? You'll be able to learn, understand those things. And it'll make the action, if in fact there is precedence in the religion, like you'll be like, wow, subhanAllah, I didn't know that. And now every time you do it, you're going to be able to understand more and more like, wow, that's beautiful. Now I know why I'm doing this. Okay. If you find out that there is no basis, right, then you can ask the scholar and say, well, is it problematic that we do this? Is it problematic that at weddings we have this practice, or at when people pass away we do that? Is it problematic? And the scholar, inshallah, if they're trained and they have understanding of fiqh, they'll be able to guide you and say, okay, this is, maybe you should avoid doing this because it has some extra religious ramifications. This is purely cultural. It's okay what clothing you wear, what color you wear, this and this. As long as you don't think that there's a religious association with it, it's fine. Then it's from mu'amalat. It's from mundane action. So the scholar, the mufti, will be able, like Mufti Kamani, Sheikh Abdel Nasser, Mufti Muntasir, Sheikh Mikhail, my colleagues that I know, Sheikh Yasser Qadi, Sheikh Yasser Burjas, those who are in Dallas locally, Sheikh Omar Suleiman, etc. They'll be able to help you navigate those situations and find, and many scholars that you have locally as well, they'll be able to help you navigate and find whether or not a certain practice that is done might be, extra religious, or it might be innovation within the religion. And inshallah khair, it won't be from the innovations, inshallah. But if it is, then we have to be very, very careful, because the Prophet ﷺ said that bid'ah, that this innovation in religion, that if it is truly an innovation, that it is something that can lead people, unfortunately, can lead them astray. And you do see some of these practices, unfortunately, in some parts of the world around maybe mausoleums and graveyards and things like that. These things are not from the religion. So we have to be careful to make sure that we are knowledgeable about our own faith, that we know what we're doing and what we should be doing and what we should not be doing as well. Barakallahu feekum, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's session on the study of Imam al-Nawawi's Arba'in, his 40 hadith. Inshallah, next week, Ustadha Fatima will be granting us, her knowledge, inshallah, for hadith number 6, which is very beautiful, actually. Al-halalu bayyin wal-haramu bayyin. That halal is clear and haram is clear, and there's a lot more after that, but that's the beginning of the hadith. It's well known. So we ask Allah Ta'ala to grant us that. Barakallahu feekum, everybody. Take care. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Love you all for the sake of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.